20 minutes. That's how long it takes for a smoker's heart rate to begin dropping back toward normal after their last cigarette. Not 20 days, not 20 years, 20 minutes. And yet millions of people who smoke will tell you, with complete sincerity, that quitting is one of the hardest things a human being can attempt. How can both of those things be true at once? How can your body begin recovering almost immediately, while your brain can keep fighting the same battle for months, sometimes years? Because the moment you stop smoking, two very different stories begin. One is happening inside your body, the other is happening inside your brain. And they don't move at the same speed. By the end of this, you'll understand why your body can start leaving smoking behind almost immediately, while your brain may still be waiting for the next cigarette. And the difference between those two timelines reveals something much bigger about addiction than most people ever realize. Picture the moment itself. A cigarette is crushed beneath a shoe. The smoke disappears into the air, and somewhere beneath the skin, an entire biological system quietly begins changing direction. Within about 20 minutes, heart rate and blood pressure begin moving back toward normal. Within hours, carbon monoxide levels in the blood fall, allowing oxygen to circulate more effectively again. The body doesn't wait for motivation. It doesn't need a promise. It doesn't need you to believe you're ready. The moment nicotine and smoke stop arriving, the body begins responding to their absence, almost as if it had been waiting for permission to repair itself. But this is where the story takes a strange turn, because the cigarette may be gone, the smoke may be gone, the nicotine may soon be gone, but the expectation remains, and that expectation lives somewhere much harder to escape. Inside the brain of a long-term smoker, repeated nicotine exposure changes the system that responds to it. Researchers using brain imaging have found that chronic smokers develop increased numbers of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, biological structures that nicotine interacts with. Think of it this way. Imagine walking into a house where one person has been invited every morning for 10 years. At first, there's one chair waiting for them, then another, then another. Eventually, the entire room begins to reorganize around their arrival. That's what repeated nicotine exposure can do to the brain. It adapts to the chemical it keeps receiving, and when that chemical suddenly disappears, the brain doesn't immediately return to its original state. The nicotine can leave the body relatively quickly. The changes built around expecting it can take much longer to fade. That's the first twist. The craving isn't simply nicotine still floating through your bloodstream. It's your brain asking for something it has learned to expect. And the brain doesn't only learn the chemical, it learns everything surrounding it. The first cigarette after waking up, the cigarette with coffee, the cigarette after dinner, the cigarette during a stressful conversation, the cigarette when you're alone in the car. Over time, these moments become connected. A smell, a location, a feeling, a particular time of day. And any of them can become a trigger. Suddenly, the desire for a cigarette can appear before you've consciously decided you want one. That's why addiction can feel so confusing. You can genuinely want to quit, and still find yourself reaching for the thing you promised yourself you'd never touch again, because part of the brain isn't asking a philosophical question about whether smoking is good or bad. It's simply recognizing a pattern. This happened before. This feeling came before, and last time, the cigarette came next. The brain remembers the sequence, and it expects the ending. But while the brain is still holding on to the habit, something else is happening much closer to the surface. The lungs are beginning their own recovery. Tiny hair-like structures called cilia help move mucus and debris out of the airways. Cigarette smoke damages and impairs them. As smoking stops, these systems can gradually begin recovering and functioning more effectively. And that can create one of the strangest experiences of quitting. The cough can temporarily get worse. For someone who doesn't understand what's happening, it can feel like proof that quitting is making things worse. But sometimes, the opposite is true. The system that was being suppressed is beginning to work again. The body is trying to clear what it has been accumulating. The cleanup has finally started. And yet the brain may interpret the discomfort as a reason to smoke again. That's the cruel paradox. The body can be moving toward recovery, while the brain is still trying to restore the habit that caused the damage. This is where addiction becomes more than a question of willpower. Because nicotine was never just about the cigarette. It was about how quickly the brain learned to expect the reward. Nicotine reaches the brain within seconds of inhalation, and that speed matters. The faster a substance produces an effect, the more easily the brain connects the behavior that came before it with the reward that follows. Smoke, inhale, nicotine, relief, again and again and again. The connection grows stronger with repetition. Cigarette manufacturers understood the importance of nicotine delivery long before the public understood the consequences. Internal tobacco industry documents, later revealed through litigation, showed decades of research into cigarette design and nicotine delivery, including additives that could alter smoke chemistry and affect how nicotine was absorbed, while cigarettes were being sold through advertising that made smoking look normal, sophisticated, even reassuring. In 1946, one famous campaign claimed that more doctors smoked a particular cigarette brand than any other. The message was simple: if doctors smoke them, how dangerous could they really be? Then, in 1964, the U.S. Surgeon General released a landmark report linking smoking to lung cancer and other serious diseases. The public conversation changed. Warnings became harder to ignore. Advertising faced increasing restrictions, and millions of smokers eventually tried to quit. But by then, the problem was no longer just the cigarette in someone's hand. For millions of people, the habit had already been built into the brain, and that's what makes addiction so difficult to escape. You aren't only trying to remove a substance, you're trying to dismantle a system of expectations that may have been reinforced thousands of times. And even after you escape the addiction, something else may still be waiting: the consequences of the past. Consider Alan Carr. Before becoming famous for his method of helping smokers quit, Carr reportedly smoked around 100 cigarettes a day. He eventually quit in 1983. His book, published in 1985, went on to sell millions of copies and became one of the best-known quitting resources in the world. Carr remained smoke-free for the rest of his life, but in 2006, he died of lung cancer. After decades of heavy smoking, his story contains an uncomfortable truth that is easy to miss. Sometimes, you can escape the addiction and still carry the consequences of having lived with it. Quitting doesn't rewind the clock. It stops the clock from running further. And that distinction matters, because the body is remarkably capable of recovery. But recovery is not the same thing as erasure. Within months and years of quitting, the risks associated with smoking begin falling. The risk of cardiovascular disease decreases. Stroke risk declines. The risk of developing certain cancers falls. The longer someone remains smoke-free, the more the balance shifts in favor of health. But the exact timeline isn't identical for everyone. It depends on how long someone smoked, how heavily, their age, their overall health, and how much damage had already occurred. So the body begins repairing itself. But the brain has a different problem. It has to learn something new, not how to smoke, but how not to. And that takes time, because the brain is built to learn through repetition. That's one of its greatest strengths. It's how a child learns to walk, how a musician learns a song, how an athlete reacts without thinking. Repeated actions become easier because the brain stops treating them as entirely new decisions. But the same system that helps you master a skill can also help build a destructive habit. The brain doesn't automatically know whether a repeated behavior is good for you. It simply learns what you repeatedly do, and that leads to one of the strangest facts about addiction. The very adaptability that allowed the brain to become dependent is also the reason recovery is possible. The brain can change in response to nicotine, and it can change again after nicotine is gone. That's neuroplasticity, the same basic ability that allows the brain to adapt after injury, learn new skills, and reorganize through experience, also gives it the capacity to move away from old patterns. But there is a catch. The brain doesn't change because you want it to. It changes because you give it something new to practice. Every time a craving arrives and you don't smoke, the old prediction becomes slightly less reliable. The brain expects the cigarette. The cigarette doesn't come. The moment passes. Then another one comes, and again, nothing happens. Slowly, the prediction begins to weaken. The trigger loses some of its power. The old pathway becomes less automatic, not instantly, not perfectly, but gradually. And this explains why a person can be completely committed to quitting and still experience a craving months or even years later. The craving doesn't necessarily mean the addiction has returned. Sometimes it means the brain has encountered an old reminder, a smell, a place, a stressful day, a memory, something that briefly activates a pathway built through years of repetition. The brain remembers, But remembering isn't the same as needing, and that may be the most important distinction in the entire story, because the body may start healing within minutes. The blood may begin recovering within hours. The lungs may begin repairing themselves over time. But the brain is playing a much longer game, slowly learning that the thing it once expected isn't coming back. And that takes something more complicated than willpower. It takes repetition in the opposite direction, which brings us back to those first 20 minutes. A cigarette has been extinguished. The smoke has disappeared. The heart begins to settle. The body starts moving forward. And somewhere inside the brain, a completely different process has begun. The brain is waiting for the next cigarette, waiting for the familiar ritual, waiting for the reward that used to arrive on schedule. But this time, nothing comes.